In our last episode, we talked about how the Germanic kingdoms essentially created the basis on which American constitutional thought and to a large degree American social life was formed. Again, it doesn't matter where your ancestors come from. You know, you drink beer and you eat butter and popcorn and all that stuff. Um, but that wasn't that was the basis. But you have a house on top of the foundation that you lay, and the foundation was laid in a crisis that occurred between about 800 and about 1,000, and then in the reaction to that crisis. Um, because what you're going to end up with are two different systems competing with each other. And we keep both of them today, but certainly there was a enormous crisis in Europe between about 800 and about 1,000. Um, and it's going to create a system that's very much against the German system that we've been discussing. But it's the reaction of the two to each other that helps create what we enjoy today. And we're spend a lot of time on doing this over the next few lectures. So, and of course, the crisis was the invasions that occurred. It actually began in the early 700s, particularly over this way with the Vikings. And 711 down here, where you have Muslim intervention called the Saracens. That's a good title. And you have the Caliphate of Cordoba pop up in here. It's actually a kind of a rogue caliphate. It's based on the old Umayyad, for those of you who are keeping score, empire, and not on the Abbasid Empire. But it doesn't really matter a whole bunch from the point of view of what we're doing here. Needless to say that there's a considerable amount of raiding that comes north out of these Muslim lands and into this region. And not only is what we today call Spain and Portugal captured, but you can see here along the coast, you're going to have a number of Muslim strongholds. In fact, you're going to have Muslim towns up here into the Alps. And then down here in southern Italy, Corsica, Sardinia, these islands, Sicily. So this is going to be a significant series of invasions. And then you have the Magyars, and we'll talk about them down the road here. And then you have the Vikings. The Vikings were bad guys. Trust me on this thing. The Magyars were slavers. They would literally swoop in to a village, surround the village, and enslave everybody in it. And then because they were on horses and the villagers were not, they would run the villagers to a port where they could be sold for slaves. And if a villager couldn't keep up, they killed them. They just threw them to the side. And so essentially, the Magyars didn't particularly care what happened to these folks. They were slaves after all. But they raided as far in as the English Channel. They didn't cross over to England. But places in Belgium were captured by the Magyars, entire villages, and taken down to some southern port in France or in Italy, over on the Adriatic Sea. And it was just they were thugs. They used long whips and they whipped their captives along. The Saracens, the folks the Muslims who occupy Spain and those islands in the Mediterranean, they were interested more in territory and treasure than in slaves, although certainly they bought slaves from the Magyars, don't get me wrong. But they, and they raided deep. They raided deep into France as well as down along the coast and up in the Alps and down along the southern part of Italy. And they also, of course, took the islands. But this was more, not so much a attempt to get people as it was an attempt to get treasure and territory. And it had a lot to do with internal Muslim politics, because you've got different groups who are competing for control of the Muslim empire. But the Vikings, far and away, were the worst. They simply pillaged and killed and burnt and sacked. Now, people, it's hard to describe how awful the Vikings were. I can tell you stories here. We don't really have time, but they were just really thugs. And a lot of the Viking violence seems to be violence just to scare the hell out of people. And people would flee hundreds of miles. There's some instances we know in France where they fled up the rivers toward the Alps and settled down. People would settle down, only to be raided hundreds of miles away from where they started by the Vikings again, and then they would flee again up into the Alps. And the end result would be that they would then be raided up in the Alps by the Vikings. It was really nightmarish. I think that word is correct on that slide there. Now, what happens? The Magyars are defeated in the mid-900s, and they go over to Hungary, which is a region around Hungary, and they settle down. The Saracens stay. They're going to be around for a very long time. Actually, 1492 is probably the official date in which they are expelled from Europe. The Vikings, they conquered all this land. They're terrorists. And then they settled down eventually, and you get places like Normandy, which is on the western coast of France. And in Normandy, they just simply settled down and became European. The Vikings did not keep their languages, by and large. They did not. A few places they did. But the Normandies, the Northmen, those from Normandy, the Normans, these folks they adopt what passed for French in those days. The Vikings who settled in England began to speak Anglo-Saxon. Vikings in Scotland and in Ireland, they began to speak Gaelic or Gallic, depending upon where you're at. So the Vikings lost their defining characteristics fairly quickly once they settled down. Now, that's not 100% true in Southern Europe, because you're going to have Viking raids in Southern Europe, and the Vikings are going to retain some of their characteristics down there. And in fact, the Vikings go through Russia and down to the Byzantine Empire, which is now in the region of Turkey, which was in the region of Turkey. And they're going to retain many of their characteristics, and they will become guards for, ironically enough, they'll become guards for the Byzantine Empire, and probably some of the best soldiers the Byzantines had. But still, this is chaos. I mean, every place you go, something is going wrong, and you're being run over. So the European response was to over-organize. Now, there's many different ways of organizing from place to place. Society was the economy, organization, the church, government such as it was, everything was so disorganized by all these raids that people, leaders, began to say, we have to have people who do this, we have to have people who do that, we have to have people who do this. And so they organized society and into what's sometimes called orders, and usually called the three orders, but although that's kind of a rough and ready way, because the society was organized differently in different places, but throughout Europe, the whole place was over-organized. And you have, in the three orders, and again, this is a generalization, you have those who pray, that's the first order. You have those who fight, That's a second order. And those who work, that's a third order. And if you are born into order 2 or order 3, you're expected to stay there. That way, the sons of knights or warriors would become warriors themselves, and that guaranteed you that you would have enough warriors to fight the Vikings in particular, but to a lesser degree the Saracens. And in fact, there's some reason to believe that this organization began as part of a reaction against Saracen raids, although very quickly it spreads to those who are being troubled by the Vikings, and again to some degree to the Magyars. So if you're born into order 2, you're going to become a warrior if you're male. If you're born into order 3, which most, the very great majority of people, were, if you're born into the third order, you were going to work probably as a peasant for the rest of your life, and your children and your children's children and your children's children's children were going to be workers too. And by the way, an attempt to escape from this could and did result in bad things happening to people who try to get out of it. In fact, if you belong to the third order and you dress as though you're in the first order or the second order, in many places that was a capital crime, and you could be killed for it. So Europe responded by over-organizing, and the response was pretty good. So it's easy to oversimplify this. That is one way of life, the loose Germanic style versus an over-organized style of life. But it was an important conflict between two different ways of thinking about things. In the long run, maybe the very long run, because you're talking about 1789 in France before this is all overthrown, the Germanic style kind of emerges as being the traditional Western European style of doing things, but it's going to take a while. And as we're going to see in other lectures, it's going to produce some great documents, the Charter of Liberties in 1100, and then, of course, Magna Carta in 1215. And we'll go through some of these things and how they came about. Anyway, I want everybody out there to have a good evening, good day. I want everybody out there to stay healthy, okay? And, we're going to do okay, all right? So everybody take care. I wish you the best, and I hope to see you all someday in the not too distant future. Take care.